welcome to Gnarly Metal After Hours, a live rock and talk show featuring conversations with announcers, musicians, and fans about radio, rock, and records of the 80s. It's an extension of my Friday night music show, Gnarly Metal. My guest today is my dear friend, college classmate, and on-air talent and author, Miss Leah Miller. Leah, thank you for joining me today. How are you?
I love to hear all those titles. You know, we identify with so many different things. I never put author in there. Thank you.
Oh, of course. Welcome. And we'll take a few minutes and talk about the book that you've written, the inspiration behind that. We'll do that a little later on. But I want to start off by asking you a question about your decision to pursue a degree in broadcast. You and I first met when we were in college.
Yes, indeed.
What made you decide to pursue in broadcasting?
Kelly, it's the answer you would expect. College radio made that change in my life. To take a step back, while I was in high school and doing homework, just like any other kid our age, I sat there with a boombox, listening to the radio and recording all your favorite songs, right? So the spirit of radio, really, what I enjoyed the most was the unknown. You know, you didn't know what was going to be played next, and you had that hope that it was going to be something you loved or something you never heard. So my addiction to radio probably started around 13, 14 years old. And it leads to a story about basically the rest of my life because of it. So I'll share that part first, if you don't mind. I was living in a small town in Michigan, about 45 minutes out of Detroit. And what I didn't understand at the time was some of the radio stations that I would spin my dial to were Canadian because of being a border town with Windsor, Ontario. So oftentimes when I was flipping around, I didn't know whether the station was from Detroit or Canada. And also what I didn't know until a little bit later in my teens was the Canadian content rule, which for Canadian radio stations means they have to play 30% Canadian artists, either artists or produced by, written by. There has to be a Canadian content to Canadian radio. And that was something that began in the 70s. What I did not know, and I did not know until I started record shopping with my own money, was that I couldn't find at my local Harmony House or whatever Michigan record store, couldn't find everything I was looking for. And about when I was like 16 or 17, I went to Canada for the first time. And by then I kind of got the picture and went 1986. I went to a Canadian record store and spent so much money on this list of all these artists that I had heard on the radio that their releases weren't available in the US. And honestly, that started my love of Canadian music and Canadian radio that continues to this very day.
Last month, my friend Rock and Roll Peg was on the air. Peg is actually also from Michigan.
Oh, where is she from?
I couldn't tell you, and I don't know exactly.
That's okay. That's right. CKLW is also very much my training ground for my music taste. And what they did was in the evening hours, they would play a show called On the Edge, and this is in the 80s, as that's when I was in high school. And what I also didn't know, but know now, is that was their way of getting their Canadian content out. They would play their hit music during the day, and then in the evenings, when you and I know in radio is, you know, less listening time for many people, they were playing their Canadian content. So it was basically an all-Canadian music show that I was listening to every night as I was doing my homework.
Yeah, you know, and that ties in with our time at KASR. And if I remember correctly, I had a show on KASR that featured Canadian music.
And maybe another little tidbit you might not know is I started college at Eastern Michigan University and worked in the college radio, which was WQBR, still exists, I guess maybe online. WQBR allowed me to have that Canadian music show, and I was also music director there. My parents made the decision to move to Arizona. And so I am a classic case of a transfer student. And so when I started at KASR with you, I had already been doing that radio show. I wasn't sure that our current management at KASR was going to accept that. However, as it turns out, the program director at the time, we'll name him because he'll come up again, Mike Messick, who you should also have on your show. Mike now owns a radio station, which is crazy.
Good for him.
Yeah, right. He was also from Michigan, knew about Canadian content, and was all for me doing a Canadian music show. What are the chances of that? Move into Arizona.
Very synchronistic. That's awesome.
Right?
I do remember Mike, and I remember, didn't he also used to, I think he was a DJ.
I want to say maybe KZZP.
Yeah, I think he did too. But that's incredible that the two of you ended up being from Michigan and landed in Arizona at the same time. And he
absolutely.
And speaking of that, we were talking about Mike as program director, but at your time at KASR, if I'm remembering this correctly, in addition to being an on-air talent, you were also the general manager, the student general manager, right?
Yeah, I went to ASU for 3 years, so I was on the 5-year plan being a transfer student. So when I got there, of course, I started working under Mike as far as getting involved in the music department. So once Mike moved up to program, I get it confused, but I think he was music director. When Mike moved up to program director, I took over as music director. But then after my year as music director, I became the general manager, station manager for KASR at Arizona State.
And as we were talking about off air, our mutual friend Paul was actually the first student general manager, and then you followed in his footsteps.
Correct. He is absolutely the number one alumni of KASR. He will always be the biggest fan of the station, and he brought the number one thing he brought to them that they still have to this day is access to the stadium to broadcast Sun Devil football. That was something that Paul brought to that radio station, and that legacy continues now in 2025. We're talking that started maybe 1986.
Well, it's a wonderful legacy to have. I think college radio is really a unique kind of experience for people who have worked in the radio industry. Some people have had the benefit of working for a very good college radio station, while other people, I think, maybe have not had that experience. And I think in today's day and age, it's a little bit different because it seems as though college radio doesn't feature the opportunity for people to be live on air as much as it is people will voice track and then they'll download their voice track into a computer software program that plays the radio station back. So ours was, I feel like, a little bit more hands-on.
Absolutely. The Cronkite School intended it to be a training ground. Even if you weren't going into radio, it was a training ground for you to learn to announce or write script. There was never any intent of it being commercial or make money. It was always there for training for broadcasting students and journalism.
Certainly benefit to us, and I am very grateful. Leah, I will tell you this story. When I graduated from college, I moved back to Colorado, and my first interview for my first job in radio, I was speaking to the couple that owned the radio station, a husband and wife, and I was talking to them about, my college education, and the wife said to me, "I see that you have a degree in broadcasting, and I'm glad to see that, but do you have any experience running a board?"
There it is.
Oh, yep, been doing it for 4 years. So,
that's right there. How could you just jump into radio without any experience? You need hands-on.
Yeah.
I want to tell you something else that'll warm your heart, I think. At this time, it is the largest club at Arizona State University. I am not kidding you. They have over 200 volunteers. They have had to change the radio shows to a half hour each because there's so many students who want to be on the radio. I will say that the Cronkite School added sports journalism, sports broadcasting to a major, so that certainly increased the interest, but it just makes me so happy to hear how active they are on campus. You still can't hear them on the radio, but who cares at this point? Right back then, we were so worried about, we need to be on terrestrial radio. Now they broadcast online, and that's all they need to do, So it just makes me so happy how active and vital they are to the campus.
And that is very heartwarming to hear, especially considering the size of Arizona State University.
Yeah.
It's a big university. And for it to have that kind of reach and that kind of presence on a university of that size, I think really speaks to the legacy and to the level of professionalism that goes behind putting together a decent college radio station.
Yes.
So before we move on, Leah, I'm going to play an air check tape of yours for our listening audience to hear.
I hope not from KASR.
No, that's funny. I have the same kind of response. My first few shows at KASR, I've got to be honest with you, I was not nearly as fluid as I am today.
And nor should we have been. We were young.
Right. Definite learning opportunity. But I'm going to go ahead and play this segment real quickly. It's just about a minute long, so I'll have you stand by. This is gnarly101.com. I'll be back with my friend Leah Miller in just a moment. Right now, though, here she is. There you go. So for everybody listening, that is my dear friend Leah Miller, and that was her doing what she does and does so well at KUKQ in Phoenix. Now, Leah, you were known as LM in the PM. How did you get that moniker?
Maybe our production manager, Mark Mayfield, probably came up with that. It flowed better as LM in the AM when I went on to do mornings, but indeed I did use it LM in the PM. Who knows? You know, we were all about alliteration and rhyming and silly things like that in the 80s. So I can't say that I fully remember. Mm-hmm. I know we're talking about KUKQ, but if you don't mind, I want to step back to KASR for a moment. Just a couple of funny stories that I want to share. I mean, there were a lot of things that happened there, and just like you, college radio was also transforming for me. I moved to Arizona in, oh my goodness, now I'm forgetting, 1987, and I did my tour of Arizona State in July of 87. Yes, in July. And I asked the tour guide if they knew where the campus radio station was, of course. I had already called the station and talked to the music director at the time. His name was Dave Dare, and I told him I was coming. But the tour guide told me, oh yeah, the radio station is next to the agriculture building. So after the tour, I'm over at the agriculture building, looking all over, never did find it. And you and I can giggle that, of course, it's next to the architecture building, not the agriculture building. So on my tour, I did not find it. However, on my first day of school in August of 87, somehow or another, I must have called again and found out where it was. I walked into the station. There were two people there, Paul Hornstein and Mike Messick. And in my head, you'll love this for your 80s show. Like, how am I going to remember these guys' names? Oh, I know. The two main guys of Loverboy, Paul and Mike. So I'll remember. Paul's the guy in charge, just like Paul Dean of Loverboy.
Oh, that's awesome. Leah, that is such a great way to remember it.
Well, I'm a cocky 20-year-old or whatever, and I'm like, I just moved here, and I was a music director at my campus radio station. And they're like, great, our DJ didn't show up. Go get on the air. I literally was on the air the first few minutes I walked into that station.
Yep.
No kidding.
And my experience is a little bit similar to yours, Leah. And I remember going into building that we had that was specifically for people who were studying broadcasting. And I went for some reason into the office. This was my second day of class. And Mary Jo was in the office, and I handed her the paperwork. She said, oh, you're new here. Welcome. You know how friendly Mary Jo was.
Bless her.
And behind me, Paul and Steve walking in.
Steve Sussman, too.
Exactly. And they're like, well, hey, what's your major? And I said, well, radio and television. I'm interested primarily in radio. They're like, oh, then you have to come by the radio station. And right there, I just knew that I found my clan.
Yeah, that's what it is. Finding your people. Such a great group of people.
We're so fortunate.
And that's what I encourage my students also.
Yes. Well, let's take a minute and talk about that, because you have had a second act, so to speak, when you left the world of radio.
Yes.
You decided to become involved in the world of academia. What made you think that this was something you wanted to do?
Very much of my life, things just fall into place without really planning them. So it was, once again, a progression forward ahead after my radio career, as we said. I had actually retired from radio, and Dr. Lee, who we mentioned already, who was the faculty advisor for the campus radio station station at ASU, asked me if I could come and be like a professional advisor for the radio station just on a part-time basis because he needed to take over running the Cronkite School. And it was good timing from a personal aspect also of my mother being ill. So I began advising the station I once ran as a student. And that was my first break into academia, if you would call it that. And as time went along, I started putting together programs for them. Oh, let's go visit another radio station. Let's have an alumni come talk about being a DJ, that type of thing. I started putting programs together. And at ASU, they had what was called living learning communities, where students live. Could you imagine this when we were in school, Kelly? You live with students in your same major in the same hall and learn together. Wow. So they wanted the Cronkite School to have a group of students who all lived together. And because I was putting together those programs, they asked me to put together this living learning community for, wouldn't that have been fun? Whoa.
Don't know how much work I would have gotten done, but it would have been a lot of fun.
I know. So at least I did that for the next maybe 7 or 8 years. It was 5 before I left ASU. So yeah, besides running the radio station, then I was also running the living learning community. And because of that, I started going to the meetings for the academic advisors. And you probably had the same academic advisor as I did, who is still working at ASU, Mary Cook. I definitely got my feet wet doing academic advising as I was given tours and all sorts of sort of behind the scenes. So it really was the next logistic step for me that I ended up becoming an academic advisor. So yes, indeed. I kind of think of a third act. The living learning was doing more putting together programming, and now it's strictly advising students.
Let's take a moment and talk about Mary, because I have had conversations with friends of mine who have gone to different colleges and universities who have found that their academic advisor really did nothing for them. And I count my stars that I was fortunate enough to have Mary Cook as my academic advisor. When I saw that you were becoming an academic advisor, it made me smile because I was like, oh my gosh, Leah's going to be just as awesome as Mary was.
I credit her all the time. Her and I got to work together a lot while I was doing the living learning community, and she got a lot of us student radio station workers out of messes. She really did. I had a bit of a mess that ASU didn't want to take my transfer credit for astronomy. I had to present anyway, so long ago. But Mary Cook, I don't know if she'll ever retire. God bless her. Everyone knows her. Yeah. She covered our butts.
And I think anybody you talk to who hears her name, everybody has something positive to say about her, because not only is she just a wonderful person, but her ability to help us take direction and to help us focus in a world that, at least for me, initially was overwhelming. The one thing I will say I remember is one summer, Paul and I took, I believe it was communication law. And I remember Mary telling me flat out, it's a challenging course. You want to take it in the summer, so you give yourself 100% of your attention to give to this course. And sure enough, she was right. And I remember Paul and I getting together over the summer and trying to study this. And here's 2 radio people going, oh my God.
Oh, you are correct. That was the worst class there was in our program. But this does connect to my radio career. That's a great segue, if you don't mind.
No, not at all.
I was blessed, and I'll tell you the story of how I got there, but as you played, I ended up working in professional radio while I was still in school on KUKQ. And if you ever look at my transcripts, my grades were pretty decent, and then they just take this downward slide the minute that I started working professional radio, because my shift was 7 to midnight. So that's prime study time. And the segue is that I remember in full color having my comm law book open on my desk at the studio, trying to do my radio show and study comm law. So I am also grateful that that I did graduate, because I think I will say I credit that I promised myself I would graduate from my parents, because I got my first full-time job in what I was going to school for while I was still a junior. And certainly the temptation could have been there to just say, hey, I'm a full-time working professional. Why am I still going to school? That's one of those ones I look up and say, thank you for what my parents instilled in me to finish college at that time.
Right, for the guidance that was there. I mean, you just were supported all the way around, and that's such a fabulous thing because people don't always have that opportunity. It's easy, I think, when you're in college to get distracted by other things.
Absolutely.
I'm going to redirect us for a moment, and
Sure.
I'm going to go ahead and play a little bit of music. As I was doing research for this show, I looked on your Facebook page and I saw a couple of the bands that you interviewed when you were at KUKQ.
I just saw one of them last week and told them, hey, I interviewed you in college.
And was that the Grapes of Wrath?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. It's funny that one of the things of saying that you interviewed them in college is that most people remember being in Arizona. I'm not saying they remembered my interview. I'm saying they remembered being in Arizona playing the Sun Club.
Well, yeah, and we could certainly have some conversations about that too, because there's a lot of venues, I think, that really helped feed the culture and the type of music at the time.
Absolutely.
But let's start it off with Social Distortion. Yes, you're listening to Gnarly Metal After Hours on gnarly101.com. You're listening to gnarly101.com. Sisters of Mercy, Temple of Love. And that is actually one of my favorite songs. There's a couple songs on the playlist that I put together, Leah, that honestly put me right back in the KASR studios. That's just
KUKQ with Sisters of Mercy.
Yes. You had a chance to interview them, right? Sisters of Mercy, when you were at KUKQ?
I think I was there and Jonathan L. did that particular one, but I do have a picture with them. They played one of our Q Fest. KUKQ had festivals. If you lived in Phoenix in the late 80s, early 90s, you probably went to a Q Fest. The Sisters of Mercy played the one that was at a baseball stadium. Maybe the Oakland A's, I'm going to go with. Anyway, they were the headliners. So I certainly interviewed many a band at both KASR and KUKQ. Very fortunate. And to see all those bands at those festivals was magical for anybody who lived in Phoenix.
I think I know the answer to this next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Did your love of music play a role in you choosing a career in radio?
Yeah. I started in Eastern Michigan, as I had mentioned, and the reason I selected Eastern Michigan was they were the only school in Michigan that had creative writing as a major. You could do like an English major, but it was actually a creative writing major. So that's how I selected my college. And probably maybe 2 months after working at the college radio station at Eastern, I changed my major to broadcasting. I think all of that listening to radio as I was in high school made the big difference. Yes. And I'll just add that in terms of being on the radio, you have people who are talented because they have a deep voice, or they have, they're sort of comedians and they're funny, what have you. But I believe, straight up a music jock. My genre was to know everything I could about the bands I was playing and having that pleasure of presenting these new bands to an audience who was hungry for it.
Yes, yeah. And what you're saying is almost word for word. My friend Peg said when I interviewed her last month, when I had her on the air, I had made reference to an interview in the San Diego Reader that Peg had done. And during the interview, she said, quote, "There is one commonality of all Rock 102 listeners." That's the station she was with at the time. She said, it's their love of rock and roll. And her and myself as well, I feel that way. The music is what really drove me to say, I want to be able to get paid to play music. That's what I want to do.
I'm not sure it exists anymore in terrestrial radio, but that's why this type of radio station like Gnarly 101 is what fuels people like ourselves to still be interested in it.
Yeah. And I'd like to believe that there's a slight difference in our presentation. We have a human voice. Our voices are not synthetic. And although there are stations today that are operating with synthetic voices, not only for advertisements, but also for announcers, I think there's some kind of passion that just is inherent in us, especially for those of us who love music, that I just don't think can or will ever be duplicated.
No, AI cannot fake enthusiasm, I hope.
Right. I hope it stays that way. When we were at KASR, our station format was alternative music. Since that time, I've come to describing the music that we played at KASR as being 80s alternative, or in some cases, maybe or maybe not new wave, because I don't want people to get confused with what alternative music is today. As I remember it, alternative was a relatively new format at that time, one which I really liked and still like. Can you tell me who or how the decision was made to have our college radio station play alternative music?
So I'm glad you asked. This was actually very interesting in the time period that you and I were at KASR, which went on to be KASC and the Blaze, still called Blaze Radio. Remember I told you that I called while I was still in Michigan, and I spoke to Dave Dare, and Dave had a very indie punk ethic. Think Minor Threat and Misfits, that genre at the time. That 2-minute punk song was what was happening. Mike Messick was working under Dave Dare and had a different feel. He was very influenced by K-Rock in Los Angeles. Mike loved that radio station, which who didn't? I mean, it was amazing. So as they switched from one being music to the other music director, the sound changed to much more of what I agree I would call 80s new wave. Alternative was a horrible title, but I want to say that a lot of times we would also say, KSR new music. I'm not sure that we always use the word alternative. Things got kind of interesting after that because KQ came into the market. So now you have the college radio station, and then you're differentiating from the commercial radio station. When I took over as music director, I stuck more with what Mike was doing because that was also my style. You wouldn't be too terribly surprised to know that some Canadian bands got thrown in there.
Did, yes.
But yeah, I think that we stayed pretty similar to that. And subsequently, Christine Pointner was after me. Pamela Aylesworth was after her. Stuck very much to the just a rich amount of new music that was coming out. The record labels at that time were clamoring for their REMs, right? Their college radio bands. And record labels, they were wining and dining college students, to be completely blunt. I went to South by Southwest. I went to College Music Journal. All of those things, these record labels reps wanted to get their music played on college radio, hoping that those college bands would make that crossover into rock radio.
That's an interesting scenario.
It was the time to be a music director. I cannot tell you how lucky I was.
What a great gig to have, and to be able to not only have the opportunity to meet the bands and to check out the bands in concert, but to have people going after you to try and sway your influence to
a 21-year-old trying to pass their comm law.
How long were you at KUKQ? How many years were you there?
I was there for we haven't gotten to that. A employee of KUKQ, KUPD. KUPD was the FM. KUKQ was the AM. Called KASR, the campus radio station. Said, "Hey, do you guys have a job board? Because we need jocks for our AM." At the time, the AM was KQ Country. I'm the one who answered the phone, and I never posted the job. And I got the job.
Well, you were the right person for the job anyway.
So I was on, my first radio job was country, and it was classic country, something I knew nothing about. And within that time period, they were in the works of changing the format in 1988 to KUKQ Alternative. And I later found out that I was an obvious hire because I was the music director at the college station. And so I already knew about the type of music they were about to to transform to. So I did not know they were changing format, but I did learn later from my coworkers that indeed my hiring made sense. So that is how I ended up on KUKQ. And I was there from 88 till we went off the air in 93. They did come back later. I was not part of the second KUKQ. I went on to be on KUPD and then KSLX and then KZON.
Leah, I didn't realize you were on KUPD. So were you there when Larry was there?
Yes, absolutely. If I could go back in time, I think they should have made Larry Mack and I a morning show team. I think we would have been just fantastic together.
100% agree. Yeah. Absolutely.
Shout out to Larry Mack, who's running stations in Tucson. Anybody who's still in radio at this point, I'm so impressed.
Right. Good on you. So I'm guessing then that it was kind of a moment of stepping aside and going, yes, when you found out that the format was going to be switched from classic country to something you're a little more familiar with and a little more passionate about.
Absolutely. It was an incredible time period to be part of. There, at that time, I believe KUKQ was the 11th commercial alternative radio station in the entire United States.
Wow.
At the time, I think there were only 11.
So it puts them kind of a little bit on the cutting edge.
Oh, well, especially when those festivals started. I'm not sure if you knew this, Kelly. Perry Farrell will admit that his idea from Lollapalooza came from Porno for Pyros playing at KQ Fest.
I had no idea. That is so cool.
So I don't know how much more groundbreaking one could be.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah. Love the idea. People enjoy getting together and listening to any kind of music, but then building community. So you find that there are people who have the same kind of enthusiasm, the same kind of passion for the music. I mean, it just lends something. And I would assume that bands who are performing can probably feel that energy as they're performing.
Oh, you wanted to be on a Q Fest. If you were a band, you wanted in on that. You know, the Facebook group for KUKQ is still very active. And if you talk to any of them, they will talk about how it transformed their lives and their musical taste.
And there's something to be said for that. I've said multiple times before that music has the ability, in my opinion, to help us transcend bad situations, but it also has the ability to help enhance good situations. There's just something about it that to me is borderline magical.
Absolutely.
It's nice to have that as a backdrop or a soundtrack to your life. As far as I'm concerned, it's a really good thing.
Oh, Kelly, and I also know that, and of course I'm biased, but the new music that was coming out at that time, I mean, this is when Depeche Mode put out Personal Jesus. This is when The Cure released Fascination Street. These are when those things were new, and now they're absolutely classic to the genre. So the time period was amazing in music.
When you were at KUKQ, when you were at KZON, you released a CD called Local Zone. Were you music director there, or was this something you put together just based on your personal preferences?
No, I was not music director there. I was a night jock. Again, later in my career, I think I started at KZON in 95, 96. Sorry, I'm a little fuzzy on those things, but my program director at the time knew of my interest and connections to the local music scene, of course, which began with KUKQ. So he offered to allow me to bring back a show originally hosted by Mary McCann, who I also worked with at KUKQ, known as the Bone Mama. Absolutely one of the most famous disc jockeys from the Phoenix area. She had originally done the Zone's local show. I believe at the time she had already left KZON. So he offered me to do the local show. Sunday nights, I was hosting the local show, and because of those connections, I just started asking them if they would come by and play acoustic. I had an amazing coworker who worked in promotions. I'll give a shout out to Keith Mack. He decided to bring in a 4-track and start recording the bands. So we actually ran it through a board, not through the studio board, and he would produce these bands performing, and I would say I just hosted and did what I do best. He got the promotion together and the sponsors to put those recordings onto a CD, and we had a limited 1,000 run of Leah's Local Zone. and we had, I think there was 12 performances on the CD. If you run into it at a used record store, you should nab it because again, there were only 1,000, and it was again my blessed life, a magical time of performances. First time Roger Clyne, the Peacemakers, did their first performance on the show. At the time, Robin Wilson from Gin Blossoms was doing his Gas Giants. I don't want to say solo project, but a different band while the Blossoms were broke up. He was on the show, Dead Hot Workshop, all of the bands that you would expect from that time period.
God, that's incredible. Yeah, and I get goosebumps when you were saying that, just in my mind, imagining a separate board coming in and being able to mix them right there in the studio. I mean, that's magical.
Yeah, there's no way I could have been doing that because I was running the show, and I was doing live radio. This was no recording back then. So he was doing that separately. And if you ever get to hear any of the tracks, it was spectacular. He did a fantastic job.
That's terrific. Well, we're going to take a break real quickly, play a little bit of music. I have my friend and on-air talent, Leah Miller, with me today. They're listening to gnarly101.com.